thank you very much for inviting me to talk here. I hope my talk isn't going to be too simplistic, because I'm going over the Judith story and everything, not knowing if everybody knows this and so on. In any case, I tried to find a topic that would in some way tie in with feminism, but it's going back earlier. It's going back to the art historical past. Okay, so anyway, Judith and female artistic identity in the late Renaissance and Baroque periods. The biblical heroine Judith became one of the most popular women with whom female artists identified in the late Renaissance and Baroque periods. Interestingly, she also invited identity on the part of various female patrons. Yet this heroic woman inspired ambivalent reactions from viewers in the Renaissance and after, for to save her people, she killed their vile enemy through violent decapitation, which from a Freudian perspective could be a metaphor for castration. Having used her seductive beauty to ensnare her male victim, women artists could have seen a parallel between the biblical heroine and their own bold transgression of conventional female roles and resulting challenge to male artists and to accepted societal norms regarding the respective roles of men and women. In this way, these female artists, and in some cases patrons, can from the perspective of our own time be viewed as forerunners of modern feminism. This presentation will first trace briefly the emergence of Judith imagery in the Renaissance, with focus on the diverse contexts and messages such imagery had in this period and after, and then discuss Judith imagery in the work of several female artists of the late Renaissance and Baroque periods, in particular Lavinia Fontana, Fede Galizia, Artemisia Gentileschi, Virginia Vezzi, and Elisabetta Sirani. The story of Judith, you may know it, but maybe not everybody does, comes from the apocryphal books of the Old Testament and provides a female counterpart to that of David. Both the biblical boy hero and the apocryphal biblical heroine were inspired by God to overcome a terrifying enemy of their people whose physical strength was vastly superior to their own. Judith was a beautiful and rich young widow when her town Bethulia was threatened by the Assyrian general Holofernes, who encamped with a large army outside of the city gates. Given the courage by God to save her people, Judith emerged from her widow's retreat, put on her finest garments and jewelry, and went to meet Holofernes, who was immediately overcome by her beauty and desirous of her. He invited her to a banquet in his camp. Judith accepted his invitation, and at the banquet made sure that he drank a lot of wine. After dinner, when they retired to his tent, and he thought she would sleep with him, he fell into a drunken stupor. She then decapitated him with his sword. Together with her maid Abra, they took away his head in a food basket. The next day, Holofernes' troops found their leader without his head, which was instead attached to one of the city gates. Terrified, they withdrew. Judith had saved her people. Medieval Christian theologians, in line with the concept of a biblical concordance between the Old and the New Testament, interpreted the virtuous and chaste Judith as a prototype of the Virgin Mary, just as David was seen as a prototype of Christ. Her story was also interpreted to refer to the church overcoming heresy. She was likewise seen to symbolize virtue overcoming vice, and in addition, she was associated allegorically with humility. Interest in Judith in the late Middle Ages is evidenced in the inclusion of her story in 14th century Florentine author Boccaccio's Concerning Famous Women, a work that remained popular throughout the Renaissance. In the 15th century, in early Renaissance Florence, both David and Judith assumed civic connotations. To quote Jacqueline Musacchio, her role in Renaissance Florence was complicated. Like David, she was an Old Testament figure whose identity became connected to that of the city, demonstrating victory against the odds and against particularly the daunting enemies. To my knowledge, the first representation of Judith in Florence, public representation, I should say, is a small statuette of the heroine on Ghiberti's Gates of Paradise, finished in 1452. You have it here, where she appears in a niche adjacent to the David panel in the bottom of left of the door. While part of a program illustrating the concordance of the Old and New Testament with David's triumph over Goliath, hinting at Christ over Satan, David clearly also refers to the divinely protected civic liberty of Florence. Judith, in addition to her traditional religious meaning, probably already had a similar civic meaning. The story of Judith was represented on Renaissance nuptial furniture, where it could have served to educate the couple, alluding to the dangers of feminine seduction, and at the same time celebrating the fidelity of Judith to her defunct husband and to her people. While acting as a metaphor for the virtue and humility of the bride, the story could also have had civic connotation that would have appealed to both spouses. Small statuettes of Judith, were in addition produced for private patrons in the second half of the Quattrocento and the early Cinquecento in Florence, where they would have had a primarily civic connotation as well. These are two small statuettes, one in Detroit and one in the Museo Bardini. And then there also are panel paintings like this, the famous one by Botticelli, and probably had that same kind of civic connotation. Shortly after the completion of Ghiberti's Gates of Paradise, Donatello made the first monumental Judith in Renaissance art, and to my knowledge, the only life-size statue of Judith from that period. This unique and powerful late work of Donatello from around 1456 is of mysterious origin in that some scholars believe it was intended for Siena, where the Old Testament heroine would have been seen as a prototype of the Virgin Mary, Siena's civic protector. If so, perhaps it was intended to decorate a public fountain, as holes in the corner of the cushion Holofernes sits on seem to indicate. Judith would have connoted Siena overcoming her enemies. It's, however, not at all certain that the statue was intended for Siena. What's clear is that it was acquired by the Medici and placed in their palace in the garden behind the courtyard. There it would have lined up perfectly with Donatello's bronze David, then located in the center of the courtyard. The pairing of David and Judith recalls Ghiberti's Gates of Paradise and surely was intended in a civic propagandistic manner. Both David and Judith were tyrannicides, and the Medici, tyrants behind the scenes, would have used both works as propaganda pieces for their support of the ideals of civic liberty of Florence. It is thus probable that the Medici, in particular Cosimo the Elder or his son Piero, were the patrons of Donatello's Judith and Holofernes from the beginning. A no longer extant inscription formerly placed on the original base of the statue explained that it illustrated how the head of pride was cut off by the hand of humility. After the Medici were exiled in 1494, Donatello's Judith was confiscated and placed in front of the main entrance to Palazzo Vecchio, then Palazzo della Signoria, and endowed with a new base on which was written that she was an example of the health and or salvation of the Republic, exemplum salutitis publicae. With a curious reversal of its original message when located in the Medici Palace, the Judith thus became a symbol of the Florentine Republic, cleansing itself of tyranny and of the Medici. In 1505, after Michelangelo's David was finished, the Judith was displaced to the loggia adjacent, replaced by Michelangelo's glorious David, seen as a more appropriate virile image of the invincible strength of the Florentine Republic. Indeed, some felt this image of a woman, so harshly decapitating a man, had brought evil onto the city. The evidence of this attitude is documented in records of a public hearing held concerning debate about where to place Michelangelo's newly completed statue. A certain Messer Francesco, first herald of the Signoria, is recorded as saying, "I have gone over and over in my mind whatever any judgment offers. There are two places where such a statue might be erected. The first is where the Judith is, and the second, the center of the courtyard of the palace where the David of Donatello is. The reason for the first is because the Judith is an emblem of death, and it's not fitting for the Republic, especially when our emblems are the cross and the lily. And I say it's not fitting that the woman should kill the man. And even more important, it, the group, was erected under an evil star, for from that day to this, things have gone from bad to worse." Evidently, the image of a woman, no matter how virtuous her cause, violently decapitating a male, was deeply disturbing to some members of Florentine society at the time. It's ironic that images of male heroes triumphing over evil through violence and murder, from David to Hercules to Perseus, never induced similar reactions in the Renaissance or after. That an ambivalent attitude towards the heroine Judith had emerged in a broader European context by the early Cinquecento is manifested in her inclusion in a series of powerful women painted by Lucas Cranach. This series focused on the female seductive power as a threat to man. Cranach's Judith, influenced by North Italian examples, in particular one by the Venetian painter Vincenzo Catena, closely resembles his Salome in her seductive beauty. As noted in the section, here we see a Salome and a Judith together, look just exactly alike. As noted in the section on the power of women in the catalog for the Cranach exhibition held in the Borghese Gallery in Rome in 2010-2011, quote, "The rivalry, or perhaps the war between the sexes, is an archetypal concept and likely a never-ending one, which every historical era expresses in its own unique way. At the outset of the modern period, between the 15th and 16th centuries, the topos of the power power or the deceit of women, Weibermacht or Weiberlist, was becoming increasingly widespread, resulting in a flourishing of subjects where a female figure used her charm to dominate, compromise, or even destroy an illustrious and unknowing man. These scenes were chiefly derived from ancient history or the Bible and included episodes as those of Aristotle and Phyllis, the mocking of Virgil in the basket, Judith and Holofernes, Samson and Delilah, Jael and Sisera, Salome with the head of John the Baptist. Here, in this art, focused toward an aristocratic audience, the message was no longer one of moral virtue, but of erotic and destructive female power. Judith, Delilah, and Salome are similarly represented, regardless of whether they were examples of virtue or vice. The main idea was they had deceived and overcome a man through feminine wiles. As the Catholic Church moves into the Counter-Reformation, the popular subject of Judith overcoming Holofernes once again becomes associated with moral virtue and the Catholic Church overcoming heresy, in particular Lutheranism, the Protestant heresy. Artists, however, frequently infuse personal identity within their rendition of this subject, which, in keeping with the stylistic developments of the early Baroque, is often rendered with shocking and harsh realism. One of the most striking examples and famous examples is that by Caravaggio, you probably know it, in the Galleria Nazionale d'Arte Antica in Rome, identified as a picture painted for the Ligurian banker Ottavio Costa in around 1599 and rediscovered only in 1951. This work captures Judith in the act of slicing off Holofernes' head, blood squirting. It has been linked with the recommendation of the Lombard artist and author Lomazzo in his treatise of 1584 that artists try to capture the transition from life to death, and to do so study the expressions of those undergoing public executions. The striking contrapposto of the beautiful and rather dainty young Judith and her maid, depicted as an ugly old crone, has been related to the advice of another Lombard art theorist, Figino, whose concept was of such a contrast, in turn likewise recalls ideas of Leonardo. It's also been suggested that Caravaggio, thought to have had a fear of decapitation even prior to a price being placed on his head after he murdered Ranuccio Tommasoni in 1606, would have put his own features, or at least his identity, into the villain and victim, Holofernes. This powerful painting by Caravaggio, which with its striking chiaroscuro leads into this artist's mature style, is particularly relevant to a consideration of those by female artists, as it directly influenced the most dramatic Judith by Artemisia Gentileschi. To my knowledge, the first female artist to represent Judith, and to do so a number of times, was Lavinia Fontana, 1552 to 1614, born in Bologna, a city known for its relatively large number of female artists who worked there from the Renaissance on. Like many of her successors, for example, Artemisia Gentileschi, Lavinia was the daughter of a successful painter, Prospero Fontana, 1512 to 1597. Prospero had a major artistic role in Bologna at the time when it was the second most important city in the Papal State. Bologna is where the final sessions of the Council of Trent, 1545 to 63, were held in the huge civic temple of San Petronio. The Council of Trent was a major factor in propelling the church into the Counter-Reformation, and both the art of Prospero and that of Lavinia must be seen in light of the historical context of the Counter-Reformation. Both artists work in the period that marks the end of Mannerism and the beginning of the Baroque style. Lavinia was extremely skilled and one of the best artists of her important city in her time. Her training was in her father's home and studio, and her style obviously is based on his. In his home, she would have had the opportunity to study from classical art as well as absorb the Renaissance style. She led a morally virtuous life in line with the Counter-Reformation ideals and was married at age 25 to Giovanni Paolo Zappi, another pupil of her father. Apparently, in contracting this marriage, Prospero assured the further development of his daughter's career. With full awareness of the mediocre quality of his son-in-law's work, he opened the path for his talented daughter to become the principal painter of the couple. Her husband did some minor work in her shop and handled the financial administration of his wife's florid career, as well as saw to the education of their children. Continually working professionally on her paintings, she bore him 11 children, but not all survived into adulthood. Lavinia was the first female artist to have major commissions for monumental altarpieces and mythological subjects, along with portraits. She had both public and private commissions and was a favorite painter of female aristocratic patrons in Bologna who eagerly sought her services for portraits. She, in addition, worked for important members of the clergy and ended her career in Rome, where she produced 2 major altarpieces. Shortly before her death, she did an enigmatic Minerva dressing for the illustrious patron and collector Cardinal Scipione Borghese, apparently the first full female nude by a female artist. Lavinia was careful to sign a great majority of her works, which illustrates her professional pride and a realization of her innovating role as a woman in a field before dominated nearly exclusively by men. Lavinia painted at least 3 versions of the subject of Judith and Holofernes. In around 1596-97, when her career reached an apex of fame, she painted the Judith now in the Oratory del Ritiro di San Pellegrino in Bologna, signed work. The painting described as a Giuditta a lume di torcia, or a Judith illuminated by a torch or candle, was formerly thought to have been patronized by a priest who was from the Bolognese noble family, Monsignor Dionisio Ratta. There's, however, a new and more convincing theory that the patron is more likely to have been Laertia Rossi Ratta, the widow of Carlo Ratta. Indeed, the heroine Judith, herself a widow, appealed to Lavinia's female patrons who were widows. The heroine, dressed in her elegant finery, looks upwards as if to show inspiration from God, and is dramatically illuminated frontally by a candle, which anticipates a type of visionary light frequently seen in Baroque painting to follow. The decapitated body of Holofernes is visible to the right of the heroine, arms outstretched, while a smaller female figure, probably Judith's maid Abra, holds up part of the cloth canopy over Holofernes' bed. The decapitated head of Holofernes lies prominently on a table in the foreground, right, and has rightly been compared to a mask or cast of an antique head, similar to one seen on a shelf in the background of Lavinia's small early self-portrait in the Uffizi. The dramatic lighting captures the intimacy of the nocturnal encounter between Judith and her victim. The beautiful fabric of Judith's dress, as well as that of the bed canopy, are handled with consummate skill. While evidencing Judith's voluptuous beauty, Lavinia's interpretation also emphasizes the heroine's moral chastity and inspiration from God, appropriate to the Counter-Reformation, as well as to her female patron. A similar interpretation of Judith by Lavinia, now in Parma, and a nearly identical picture in London, you see them both up there, were probably painted slightly earlier, 1592 to 94, and shared a dramatic lighting, luxurious bed canopy, and lavish garments with the Judith in Bologna just described, but are more dynamic. With Judith caught in action, her legs spread apart, one sensually projecting forward and covered only by some filmy transparent fabric, as she reaches the head of the decapitated Holofernes, still dripping with blood, towards her maid Abra, who's about to wrap it in cloth. The maid, with her wrinkled and aged face, contrasts the young and beautiful Judith, whose head is particularly lavishly adorned with jewels. The erotic sensuality of the heroine is boldly presented. The scimitar of the general lays on the ground in the lower left. The decapitated neck of Holofernes, whose foreshortened body recedes into the bed canopy, is prominent on the left edge of the composition in the Parma painting, but curiously, discreetly hidden by some of the drapery of the bed canopy in the London painting, which I kind of wonder if it was reworked at some point to soften it a bit. Those striking Judiths by Lavinia are, to my knowledge, the most dramatic and violent treatments of the subject by a female artist, prior to those by Artemisia Gentileschi. Did Lavinia identify with her subject? It seems most likely that she did, possibly putting her own somewhat idealized features into those of Judith and identifying with the strong and virtuous personality of the biblical heroine, as well as perhaps with her beauty and erotic allure. At the same time, the Counter-Reformation message of the Catholic Church fighting heresy and Protestantism would have made this subject appropriate for his time. As the critic Vera Fortunati noted, quote, before Artemisia Gentileschi and other women artists, Fontana seemed to identify with, quote, strong women of the Bible, to whom she attributed decorum, strength, gracefulness, and responsibility for their own actions. A third version, there we go, by Lavinia is found in the, of Judith, is found in the Davia Bargellini Museum in Bologna, signed and dated 1600. It's been convincingly argued that this work was done for Costanza Bianchetti, the rich widow of Galeazzo Bargellini, who died in tragic circumstances in 1596, making it likely that this patron identified with the rich and virtuous widow and heroine, and thus underlining contemporary female identity with this subject. In this mature work, Lavinia has concentrated on the extraordinary finesse of the fabrics and jewelry of Judith, who stands out strongly in the composition due to her red dress adorned with veils woven of gold thread. Her pendant, hanging from a string of pearls, includes a filigreed peacock, here said to symbolize generosity and a loyal heart, is what Vera Fortunati says. The composition is less dynamic and dramatic than that of the painting in Parma just described. Judith holds the decapitated head of Holofernes by the hair in her left hand, while the sword she used is held up in a triumphant gesture in her right hand. Her maid, rendered far less aged than in the Parma Judith, stands close to the heroine to her right and holds a basket filled with luxurious cloth in which the head is about to be placed. It's been proposed that the face of Judith is actually a self-portrait, but it's also been proposed to be a portrait of the patron. Indeed, Judith's appearance has been described as, quote, between that of a noblewoman's portrait and an ideal self-portrait of the artist. Rosa Robinson, who completed her master's thesis on self-portraits by women artists for SACI last summer, has suggested that the maid is instead a self-portrait, while Judith is a patron portrait. However it may be, both Judiths in Bologna by Lavinia definitely underscored that the subject became associated with the female identity of the artist and her patron. Around the same time that Lavinia Fontana painted her Judith just discussed, Fede Galizia, 1578 to 1630, a Lombard artist about whom little is known and more hopefully will sometime come to light, painted a gorgeous Judith with the head of Holofernes, located in the Borghese Gallery in Rome, the composition of which is so similar to that of Lavinia's version of the subject in the Davia Bargellini Museum as to suggest some direct connection between the two works, even if such a connection, or even any direction between these two artists, is to my knowledge not documented. Fede was the daughter of a miniaturist. They're always daughters of artist Nunzio Galizia, and is said to have been a child prodigy. She was born in and worked in Milan and was already described as an extraordinary talent when she was 12. Her initial training was from her father as a miniaturist. At the age of 16, she had established a career as a portraitist. She also did still lifes and public commissions for churches. In 1602, at age 24, she painted a cup of plums, pears, and a rose, unfortunately now lost, but considered the first dated still life by an Italian artist, approximately contemporary with Caravaggio's Basket of Fruit, which he may have known. Rumors of an introverted character and unattractive appearance need further investigation. Fede's Judith in the Borghese Gallery, here on the screen, provides still another example of this subject painted by a woman prior to the famous ones by Artemisia Gentileschi. This painting is signed and dated 1601. There's another one, 1596, that's in Florida. Fede, like Lavinia Fontana, has definitely captured the seductive beauty of the biblical heroine. Her skillful rendition of Judith's jewelry, including the pearls decorating her hair, necklace, and earrings, underlines her technical virtuosity, as well as reminds of her training as a miniaturist. The contrast between the youthful and radiant beauty of Judith and her aged maid, Abra, also recalls the Lombard writer on art Figino, who, as noted earlier, recommended such a contrapposto of youth beauty and age ugliness. The lavish bed canopy both complements the blood on Judith's sword and adds to the atmosphere of luxury in the setting. Did Fede identify with this subject? Who was the patron? If, as rumored, the talented and precocious Fede indeed had an introverted character and unattractive appearance, might her confident and beautiful Judith be an ideal self-projection, possibly with awareness of one of the ones by Lavinia as competitive inspiration? I simply posed the questions. I didn't have the answer. Artemisia Gentileschi, it's a portrait of her by Simon Vouet, 1593 to 1653, is the most celebrated Italian female painter of the 17th century, and her many Judiths are among her most famous as well as infamous works. It's most likely that she was aware of Lavinia Fontana and had met her in Rome, quite possibly in a meeting arranged by her father Orazio, where Lavinia spent the last decade of her life. Whether she knew of Lavinia's paintings of Judith is an open question, but it is a possibility. Another question that might be posed is whether she knew of Fede Galizia's Judith, now in the Borghese Gallery. However that may be, Artemisia's personal identity with her celebrated and shockingly powerful, especially in her Naples and Uffizi versions, even violent treatments of the subject, has been convincingly related to her life experiences in the ever-expanding Artemisia scholarship. Born and raised in Rome, a major center of artistic patronage in the early Seicento, and the daughter of an esteemed painter, Orazio Gentileschi, 1563 to 1639, her first works grow out of her father's style since he was her master. Orazio was very attached and very proud of his, very proud of his talented daughter, who in some way came to replace her mother in Orazio's affections following her mother's early death. Orazio was born in Pisa and trained in the late Mannerist style of Tuscany, but became strongly strongly influenced by Caravaggio when he moved to Rome. He had an international career and produced works for the European aristocracy, from the Savoy Dukes of Turin to King Charles I of England, in whose service he died. Orazio collaborated with another Tuscan painter in Rome, Agostino Tassi, 1580 approximately to 1644, originally from Florence, who was known for his skill in perspective. Indeed, Orazio sent Artemisia, probably most of you know this story, I didn't know, at age 19 in 1612 to Agostino for lessons in perspective. What exactly happened between the two remains somewhat obscure, but one thing that is certain is that Orazio brought his colleague Agostino to court, charged with raping Artemisia. A humiliating and gruesome rape trial followed, the records of which are fully preserved. Artemisia was tortured with thumb screws to see if she was telling the truth and subjected to a gynecological examination by a nun. Agostino's defense maintained that Artemisia was a loose woman, the fact that she continued the relationship with him after the rape, apparently because he had promised to marry her to repair the damage, did not help. Tassi, clearly an unreliable personality who had lied to her when he promised marriage, as he was already married, was condemned but served only a brief jail sentence. Following the rape trial, Artemisia was quickly married to a Florentine artist, Pier Antonio Stiatesi, who was a friend of the Gentileschi family. More problems filled Artemisia's personal life in Florence, where she moved from 1613 to 20 approximately. She gave birth to 4 children between 1613 and 17, only one of whom, a daughter named Palmira Prudencia, survived into adulthood. Artemisia's marriage soon also became problematic. The couple was in fact debt-ridden. Despite the difficult events in her personal life, Artemisia's career in Florence met with considerable success. She was admitted as the first female member to the prestigious Accademia del Disegno, the first formal Florentine art academy, which had been founded in 1563 under Duke Cosimo I and Vasari. She enjoyed the patronage of important personalities, from Duke Cosimo II and his wife Maria Maddalena of Austria to Michelangelo Buonarroti the Younger, the grandnephew of the great artist of the same name. Recently, it's been discovered that Artemisia was guilty of adultery. Her passionate love letters to the handsome Florentine nobleman Francesco Maringhi were found and exhibited in a show on the artist in Milan in 2011. To hide their affair, the letters were signed with false names. It seems that her affair with Maringhi began approximately in 1617, probably after the weaning of her 4th child. This was another reason for her marriage's failure. Ridden with debts, she and her husband fled Florence in 1620 with the help of Maringhi, together with their son Cristoforo and their daughter Palmira Prudencia, and probably after a stay in Bologna moved to Rome. Shortly after their departure, Cristoforo died at age 5. Her husband soon disappeared from the picture. There are no more records of his presence in her household from 1623 on. In the early 1620s, she probably accompanied her father to work in Genova, but passed most of the 1620s working successfully in Rome. In 1630, she moved to Naples, a much larger city than Rome at the time. There she worked for most of the 1630s. She had another daughter, probably from Maringhi, who seems to have stayed with her for the rest of her life, moving definitively to Naples when she went there, but they never married unless secretly. The last decade of her life was spent in Naples, where she died. During her lifetime, Artemisia was marveled at as an unusual phenomenon of nature, as were other female artists. The androgynous virile strength with which she endowed her women does mirror her personality. In a letter to a patron, she wrote, quote, "You'll find the spirit, animo of Caesar in this soul anima of a woman." But Artemisia also shocked people, arousing negative reactions to her and her art in her lifetime and after. This is evidenced, for example, in a satirical epitaph published shortly after her death, which can be translated as, "By painting one likeness after another, I earned no end of merit in the world, while to carve 2 horns upon my husband's head," in Italian the concept of hornet refers to one who is cuckolded, "I put down the brush and took a chisel instead. Heart sees, gentle woo men was I ever to anyone who was able to see me in the unseen world. But now that hid beneath these marble slabs I lie, allure turns to bait, and gentle worm-eaten am I." Artemisia's reputation suffered from both the rape and the fact that she committed adultery. Artemisia's first outstanding Judith is apparently her Judith slaying Holofernes, now in Capodimonte Museum in Naples. This Naples Judith is unprecedented in terms of earlier female artists' work, in terms of the violence with which the theme is depicted. It clearly is inspired from Caravaggio's Judith and Holofernes in Rome, which Artemisia must have known, and which she both builds on and challenges in her version of the subject. In contrast to Caravaggio, Artemisia's Judith is stronger and seems more adapted to her bloody task, while maintaining her feminine sensual appeal appropriate to the theme. Holofernes' blood is vividly real as it soaks into the sheets, and Abra, Judith made, is notably younger than in most preceding renditions of the subject and collaborates actively with Judith by holding down Holofernes, making the entire image more credible in terms of how two women would go about killing a large drunken man. It's not really biblically correct because the maid was supposed to be outside, but it works visually. Even if unsigned, the attribution of the Naples Judith to Artemisia is confirmed by the unmistakable similarity to a similar version of the same subject in the Uffizi. Mary Gerard has dated the Naples Judith immediately after the rape, hence circa 1612-1613. Rosa Robinson, who I mentioned earlier, ex-master student, believes it is the work mentioned in the rape trial that Artemisia presumably had given to Agostino Tassi, or which he had taken and which Orazio wanted back. Gerard's date, of course, could be questioned. In early scholarship, this was thought a copy of the Uffizi version to be discussed shortly, and Roberta is sitting in here. Roberta Lapucci, too, believes it's from her Neapolitan period, hence a late work, due to the similarities which the painting evidences in palette and technique to Artemisia's documented works done in Naples. A compromise between those who place it just after the rape and those who see it as a later work could be that it was initially painted right after the rape but reworked in her Neapolitan period. The recent exhibition on Artemisia held in Rome just last year, 2016-17, included new information about his work, in particular that it was in all likelihood the Judith acquired by Laura Corsini Corsi in the early 1620s and proposed a date of around 1617 for the work. The Corsini family had properties and a villa near Naples, which could help explain how the picture ended up there. The acquisition of this striking work by a woman could further underline the connection women felt with this subject. Artemisia painted, I had this comparison with the Caravaggio, sorry. Artemisia painted another powerful Judith, thought to be from around 1613, 1614 in Florence, where it's now in the Galleria Palatina. This famous work probably was done for Duke Cosimo II Medici, yet exact documentation of its patronage, to my knowledge, does not survive. Sometimes I wonder, could it have been done for Maria Maddalena, but I don't know. Anyway, the moment of psychic tension as Judith and her maid Abra, in close communion, are leaving Holofernes' tent and hope not to be discovered, is brilliantly captured. Note the near equal age of the two women once again. Gerard has pointed out that the elaborate decorative details of Artemisia's Judith in the Pitti demonstrate her receptivity to the influence of the local maniera style. Note the cameo in Judith's hair, apparently with an image of David. I think I have a detail there. And the pearls stitched to her dress, and the Medusa head without snakes on the hilt of the sword. This painting would show Artemisia adapting her Caravaggesque realism to the taste of the Medici court. Above all, one must note the virile strength Artemisia gave to her heroine. Recall her statement that a patron would find the soul of Caesar in that of Artemisia. There can be no doubt that Artemisia put her identity into this picture. Note how Judith's profile resembles that of Michelangelo's great David. The parallel with Michelangelo's David, underlined by the cameo in her hair, may well have deliberately been tailored to a Florentine audience. After all, even if originally associated with the invincible strength of the government of the Florentine Republic versus tyranny, Michelangelo's David continued to symbolize just government during the reign of the Medici Grand Dukes. Perhaps Artemisia's most famous work, literally a signature work, it's signed, is her Judith slaying Holofernes of around 1620 in the Uffizi, done towards the end of her Florentine period, or shortly after, most likely for Duke Cosimo II. These large paintings, signed in the lower right, Ego Artemisia Lomi Fece, is nearly identical to the Naples version, except Judith seems still more powerful and virile, and wears a yellow instead of a blue dress. More of Holofernes' body shows, and the blood is better preserved, squirting in a most convincing way from Holofernes' partially severed neck and soaking into the sheets on his bed. One scholar has claimed that the squirts of blood illustrate the physicist Galileo Galilei's theories of parabolic paths. Oops, that's coming later. Galileo and Artemisia were friends. On the subject of the blood, this may seem a little shocking, but I thought it was interesting. And I have Marilena Mosco is sitting in here to thank for this, for pointing it out. A French observer compared the Uffizi Judith to an image of birth, where Holofernes' raised arms, like those of a woman giving birth, and his head to a baby emerging from the mother's body, the blood resembling that accompanying childbirth. This interesting observation definitely underlines Artemisia's female perspective on the subject. Not everybody may agree, but I thought it was interesting. By the time she painted the Uffizi Judith, Artemisia had given birth to 4 children. A further association between Artemisia and the Uffizi Judith was pointed out by Gerard, who noticed that the bracelet that Judith wears has small cameos with what she claims are images of Artemis on them. Artemis, who Artemisia is named after. This would corroborate Artemisia's association both with the chaste huntress goddess and with Judith. Noteworthy is how Judith's vertically positioned sword, pointing down as she slices through Holofernes' neck, resembles a cross, underlining her inspiration from God to perform this heroic act. As with the Naples Judith, many have seen this painting as a revenge against Tassi, but the powerful Judith also mirrors the bold character of the woman who, in her own words, embodied the spirit of Caesar and who has outdone male artists, even Caravaggio, in her interpretation of the biblical heroine. No woman had treated the subject of Judith with such force before or after. As Gerard notes, Artemisia's Judiths are positively cathartic and liberating from patriarchal control in a broader sense than simply as revenge for her violation by Tassi. Artemisia provoked mixed reactions of awe and shock in her audiences. It seems even in recent times, since this powerful painting remained hidden in a shadowy corner in the Vasari corridor for many years until mounting focus on and fascination with Artemisia, with feminism, of course, in the late 20th century, mandated its display to a larger audience. Another great Judith was produced by Artemisia after her return to Rome around 1625, her Judith with the head of Holofernes, now in Detroit. This variant of the theme of Judith is striking for the use of the candle on the table as a light source. Particularly noteworthy is in the painting is the shadow in the shape of a crescent moon on Judith's face, recalling Galileo's drawings of the shadows of the moon and acting almost like a signature for this work by underlining the artist's association with the chaste huntress Artemis, whose independence from men anticipates the Virgin Mary, likewise associated with the crescent moon. The moon, in its association with the feminine and night, paradoxically also connoted the dark and the sinister versus the sun associated with Apollo and day. Artemisia's Judiths are increasingly powerful women. This one wears boots, which empower as they do women in today's fashions. Again, the moment of tension and fear of being discovered after the decapitation is chosen, as in the version in the Pitti. The patron and original context of this work are, to my knowledge, unknown. 2 workshop versions of the same composition date from her late Neapolitan period. It seems that the subject of Judith had become one associated with the artist by her patrons. Although Artemisia painted many other female protagonists from biblical and classical history, the heroine most associated with her is Judith. Artemisia's Judith seemed to embody both the virtuous and the darker side of the heroine's act. Artemisia's whole life story seems particularly suited to analogies with this remarkable female heroine in her diverse connotations. Courageous, bold, heroic as an artist in that she transgressed what was generally associated with subject matter and or the treatment of subject matter appropriate to the female hand, but also beautiful and even provocative. The question of whether any of her Judiths are literally self-portraits has been raised. Rosa Robinson proposed that they are in the Naples and Uffizi versions, but according to Mary Gerard, they are likely not, although they bear a generic resemblance to her. Instead, Gerard sees a closer resemblance to Artemisia and Abra, Judith's maid, especially in the Detroit Judith. According to her, quote, she might well have refrained from a too direct and exclusive identification with the executioner herself, the figure whose action could have been dangerously close to her own repressed fantasies. As with Lavinia's Judith, whether or not any are literal self-portraits, her identity is incontrovertibly in this heroine. I would like to very briefly mention Judith by the Florentine artist Cristofano Allori, 1577 to 1621, a close friend of Artemisia and the godfather of her son Cristoforo. His highly skillful and elegant Judith, with the head of Holofernes from around the same time as Artemisia's Judith, and also in the Galleria Palatina, the most famous of 3 very similar versions of the subject that he painted, seems to be a clever response to Artemisia's Judith. The luxuriant gold fabric of Judith's dress resembles a color often used by Artemisia, and the work could be a tribute to Artemisia. Ironically, Allori is said to have put his own self-portrait into Holofernes, while his Judith would be a portrait of his lover, a woman known as La Mazzafira, and Abra is said to be La Mazzafira's mother, which provides a new twist on the Judith theme, making it a reference to Allori's torment by his lover. Artemisia Judith seemed to have influenced at least one other female artist to put her identity into the subject, Virginia Vezzi, or da Vezzo, 1601-38, born in Velletri, but who, encouraged by her father, settled in Rome to study art. There she met the French painter Simon Vouet, who she married. He's the one who made the portrait of Artemisia I showed earlier. Virginia followed him to Paris when he entered the service of King Louis XIII in 1626 and remained there until her death. More needs to be learned about her life and career. Her Judith and Holofernes, there you have it, painted in Rome, 1624-26, during a period when her husband was friends with Artemisia, who he painted the radiantly beautiful portrait of then, that I showed earlier, is quite probably an idealized self-reference. Could it possibly also embody some jealousy of Artemisia and a competitive assertion of her own strength as a woman and an artist in face of the, by then, famous Artemisia? I simply ask it as a question. Elisabetta Sirani of Bologna is another interesting female artist, lived 1638 to 1665, who represented Judith and who put her identity into the subject. It's debated as to whether or not she was aware of Artemisia Gentileschi's Judith, but with their evident message of female power. Elisabetta, like Artemisia, was also the daughter of a painter. Her father was Giovanni Andrea Sirani, who was a pupil of the famous Bolognese classic painter Guido Reni. As was typical of painters' daughters in the time, her father was her teacher, and through him, Elisabetta developed a classic style recalling that of Reni. Sirani's career began at age 17 and lasted only a decade due to her premature death at age 27. It used to be thought that she was poisoned either by a rejected suitor or by a domestic servant in the Sirani household, but recent analysis based on descriptions from an autopsy has concluded she died of a severe stomach ulcer. Though very brief, her career was a phenomenal and prolific one. Indeed, her fame during her lifetime was greater than that of Lavinia Fontana, whose successful career she certainly would have been aware of. She produced several hundred works in her decade-long career. Many were small-format Madonnas for private worship, but Elisabetta likewise produced altarpieces for churches and experimented with the subject of strong female heroines, recalling perhaps deliberately Artemisia Gentileschi. Her interest in female heroines could, however, have also been stimulated by Lavinia's work, including her Judith, independent of a knowledge of Artemisia's heroines. As noted by Anne Sutherland Harris, Elisabetta demonstrated a degree of ambition beyond that of many male artists when she undertook several large, complex, multi-figure compositions when she was only 20. Harris also adds that Elisabetta, quote, consciously chose to avoid that less prestigious specialty of portraits most of the time and to focus on history painting for both public and private commissions. That decision also implies an awareness of Lavinia's career and a desire to surpass her Bolognese predecessor. As aptly stated by Fortunati, who quotes an 18th century writer, Luigi Crespi, the figure of Sirani, the virgin artist who paints like a man and acts, quote, never as a woman, but moreover acts like a man, quote, more than a man does, quote, became an, quote, anthropological curiosity. Sirani was thought of as a, quote, chaste and virile woman who exceeded the limits of her gender. Elisabetta's talents were unfortunately not allowed to blossom to the fullest due to her untimely death. She was known to be able to work very quickly to the amazement of those who came to watch her paint or draw. When she was not yet 20, a Franciscan of Bologna recommended her to Cardinal Leopoldo Medici, a brother of Duke Ferdinand II, thus, "May your most serene highness be pleased to observe this little sketch done by the hand of a child most skilled, the daughter of Cyrano of Bologna, aged 19 years circa, who does paint like a man, with much readiness and imagination." The biggest compliment to a woman artist was that she painted like a man. Elisabetta was patronized by the Medici, in particular the Duchess Vittoria della Rovere, to produce a charming painting celebrating the marriage of the future Grand Duke Cosimo III and the French royal princess Marguerite Louise of Orleans. It's famous, but I didn't bring it in. Baldassare Franceschini, known as Volterrano, a Tuscan artist who worked extensively for the Medici court, described her as, quote, the best master of the paintbrush who lived in Bologna. Her relationship with her father seems to have been a difficult one. He, in fact, retained all of her earnings, and was a very difficult one, and according to the biographer Malvasia, to have some spending money, she had to paint secretly for her clients. Her father seems to have also prohibited her from developing her career outside of his home. In fact, he came to at least partially depend on her financially after being struck by a disease that deformed and disfigured his hands so he could no longer paint. Upon her premature death, her funeral, celebrated in San Domenico in Bologna, featured a temporary construction
collection, including a dome adorned with trophies and scrolls, quote, under which one could admire the life-size statue of Madame Sirani seated majestically in the middle in the act of painting. This funerary construction underlines the fame and the prodigal artist had reached at the end of her career. She was buried next to Guido Reni in San Domenico, which led to the curious legend that she was his fiancée, which is of course impossible given that she was only 4 years old when Reni died. Instead, her burial adjacent to the great master no doubt was meant to paragon her fame to his. Very early in her career, a 20-year-old Elisabetta did a self-portrait as a saint looking up to heaven in her first public commission in an enormous altarpiece for the Certosa of Bologna depicting the baptism of Christ. This fragmentary and unfortunately heavily reworked image of the artist as modest and devout might be interpreted as a self-conscious statement about her moral chastity, perhaps in contrast to the reputations of Artemisia Gentileschi, if she knew about her, and of Properzia de' Rossi, who Elisabetta certainly would have known about, as she was a Bolognese artist and the only female sculptor of the Renaissance, an artist known for her beauty and for her transgressions of accepted social norms and even for brushes with the law. Elisabetta painted several Judiths in her brief career, the most famous of which is the Judith Triumphant of 1658, done for the rich Bolognese banker Andrea Catellani, probably for his study in his home and now in Stamford. In contrast to Artemisia's violent Judith and even to Lavinia's first Judith, now in Parma, Elisabetta, as noted by Anne Sutherland Harris, chose the far less frequently depicted climax of the story, with Judith on a platform high above a large crowd of her fellow townspeople, to whom she displays in triumph the severed head of Holofernes. Elisabetta stresses Judith's chastity, which many who read the story of the beautifully dressed heroine plying the victim with wine and stories in his tent must have questioned. She does this by covering Judith's body with layers of clothing and putting the moon in the upper left corner. It alludes to the Virgin Mary, shown on a half moon in images of her as immaculate, that is conceived without sin as well as sinless. Thus, Elisabetta depicts Judith as a, quote, type of virtue, her original role in medieval iconography, but one tarnished by many ambiguous representations in 16th and 17th century art. The presence of the moon in Elisabetta's work, the presence of the moon in Elisabetta's work is interesting. It would seem to have a rather different message than the moon imagery in Artemisia's work, even if in both prefigurations of the Virgin Mary may be implicit. It could be hypothesized that Elisabetta's personal identity with Judith underlines both her strength and her own chastity and moral virtue. And some say it's actually a self-portrait. A somewhat less monumental Judith, also by, or at least attributed to Sirani, possibly from the 1660s, is in the Walters Art Gallery in Baltimore. This elaborately dressed Judith, holding the head of Holofernes by two locks of his hair, turns her strongly illuminated face, wearing an almost melancholy expression modestly away from the bloody head of Holofernes, which her maid Abra, who is mainly in shadow, is about to wrap in abundant fabric. Holofernes' sword is diagonally propped against a tassel under some cloth at an angle echoing that of Holofernes' head. The carefully arranged and skillfully, it's the last page, I'm almost done, rendered composition highlights Judith's modesty and her courage, while the strong light on her underlines God's role in her triumph. As a pendant to her monumental and famous Triumphant Judith, now in Stamford, her most famous painting, really, the Triumphant Judith in Stamford. Sirani produced a large Timoclea, maybe I've never heard of this subject, throwing the captain of Alexander the Great into a well. Signed and dated is 1659, and now in the Museo di Capodimonte in Naples, but hidden somewhere. They don't have it on display. This was also for the rich Bolognese banker Andrea Catellani. Timoclea, femme forte from the life of Alexander the Great by Plutarch, was a matron of Thebes who was raped by one of the Thracian captains of Alexander, after which she threw him into a well, where she cleverly told him she had hidden her treasure. She finished the killing by throwing rocks on him. This painting was much admired and copied in prints, and is, to my knowledge, really quite unique in its time. The virile strength of the classical heroine recalls Artemisia Gentileschi. A noteworthy difference between Sirani's treatment of her heroines and those of Artemisia, however, is their total lack of eroticism, as noticed by Babette Bone. She has done a lot of studies of Sirani. Sirani surely identified with her heroines, into whom she would have put her personal ambition, her moral virtue, and perhaps even her frustration due to the constraints imposed upon her by a dominating father. It's curious that a small canvas in the Galleria Nazionale d'Arte Antica in Rome, thought to be a representation of Beatrice Cenci and formerly attributed to Guido Reni, is now attributed to Elisabetta Sirani. Beatrice Cenci, 1577 to 1599, 22 years, was a Roman noblewoman who was the daughter of the rich Francesco Cenci, a violent and corrupt man who repeatedly raped his own daughter. Frustrated with her maltreatment, Beatrice, in agreement with her siblings and stepmother, conspired to murder her cruel father. In punishment, she, together with her sister Petronia, were condemned to death with the approval of Pope Clement VIII. Beatrice and Petronia were horribly decapitated on the Ponte Sant'Angelo in 1599. It's thought that Caravaggio could have witnessed their public execution and remembered it when he painted his Judith and Holofernes. The subject of a daughter oppressed by an overbearing father figure could well have been of interest to Sirani, whose father both exploited and constrained his daughter's career. Beatrice Cenci has become an icon of unjust female oppression. To conclude, it's evident that female artists of the late Renaissance and Baroque periods discussed who represented Judith each approached the subject somewhat differently, yet each also put something of their own identity into the biblical heroine. Each must have recognized her as a symbol of female fortitude and of a reversal of conventional patriarchal authority. That the two male artists brought into this discussion who are contemporary with the women covered, Caravaggio and Cristofano Allori, identified instead with the victim villain Holofernes in their representations of the same subject, clarifies this point. Like Judith, these women broke the bonds of tradition and thus forged a path for future women to follow. I end with what I see as a most apt quote from Anne Sutherland Harris's essay on Artemisia Gentileschi and Elisabetta Sirani. We must not forget that these women were the path makers for all women who now go to art schools and universities and take up professions that were utterly unknown to women in past centuries. Every time we step outside alone, we are taking for granted a freedom to live our own lives without an ever-present male guardian, something still not available to millions of women in some parts of the world. So. Thank you. Anybody have a comment or question that they would like to ask? Or maybe you're all too hungry for lunch. I apologize for going over a little tiny bit.
Hi, thank you, Helen. I have a question. When you show the two images, the two pictures of Lavinia Fontana of the two similar Judith and Holofernes, what was one in Detroit, that was interesting because the two images are perfectly identical, or mostly, but the difference is in the faces of Holofernes. You see that the two faces. So I wonder if they are portrait of some.
It's possible. I also noticed that this one, the bloody neck is hidden a little bit, and there's not blood dripping down.
And here there is.
I wonder if in some way been softened by later retouching or something.
No, I wonder if there are portraits. It would be interesting to know if there are, because there are. That was, and about the moon and the idea of the moon. In the biblical account, there is any account of the moon? If there was a night without moon, if it was. No. Okay.
There was a very strong debate going on of whether the moon was solid and could, reflect light, or whether it was transcendental.
No, I know.
And so the sickle moon is considered the one acceptable to the church that wasn't stopped by the Inquisition, but the solid moon that Galileo showed was actually prohibited at a certain time. So Artemisia is actually showing the reflection of light, which shows the beliefs of Galileo, which is very interesting.
I think you were asking something slightly different.
I was asking if maybe in the
Bible there's anything about it.
In the Bible was talking about how was the moon by night, because in any case, coming back by night.
Travel by moonlight, and I don't remember how the moon was.
I'd have to look up that too. I'm not sure.
I was thinking if maybe it was an account, a metaphorical account of the night.
I didn't know. Does anybody know the answer to that? With what kind of moon was out at that time? Any other questions? Or Robert.
Just a consideration. Why these female artists didn't have children, or had a lot and they all didn't survive?
Well, Artemisia had one that survived.
Yes, but only. You said Lavinia, 11 and non-survivor. Could the materials be dangerous and toxic for their health as a conservator.
It's
and
possible, but I
this
think
is why no female women, no female artists.
I think it's also that there was just a larger female mortality back in those times.
This is something we should check, because
it'd be
11
interesting.
non-survived
But
after
some
young
survived.
age.
Some survived. It wasn't all 11 that died, and the first 2 died right after they were born, practically. So they couldn't have died yet from the exposure to the toxic materials, unless they were in her, unless she had taken them in,
And they
and there
were
was something in
together with
her.
her, and she was breastfeeding, so
Yes,
also
that-
they pass immediately. So
Yeah, what we don't
that's
know.
one question just to develop.
It's
And
very
the
interesting.
second is the dress of Judith, because yellow and green is a betrayer, red and blue is a
Yellow
a
is the color of a
healthy-
betrayer. The prostitutes
is
often
a
wore that, and
spiritual
she.
and powerful person.
Yeah.
So there are big changes in these Artemisias, also for the Artemisia.
It's true. Yeah. No,
And the third is this lady is writing a book on Beatrice Cenci after writing
Oh, how
one on
interesting!
Lena's.
Fascinating.
Alessandra.
That's really great. No, because very interesting. The whole topic of how she was unjustly killed. That would you like to say something more about it? That would be very interesting.
Yeah,
to know.
actually, that we've been studying this painting for a long time, and now the kind of the latest attribution interpretation, it might be Ginevra Cantofoli. So
who was a student of.
who was a student
Yeah,
of,
she was a student of Elisabetta Sirani, because Elisabetta Sirani had a school for women artists, trained her sisters, and also that Ginevra Cantofoli was one of her students. So now they think it's Ginevra Cantofoli.
might be.
There are also other paintings by Ginevra Cantofoli where she seems to have put herself into the paintings, and but there's her self-portrait, and then now I saw one at the antiquarian show, but not this one, several years ago, but I don't remember what the subject was. But she has
Here in
very
Florence,
few.
I mean.
She has very few paintings that are attributed to her. So,
Yeah, that's the problem.
and what
Also,
is
for Virginia D'Avezzo, she died in childbirth
also so
of
many
her
died.
11th child.
Oh,
so
oh my.
probably this is not a very auspicious number, but
Yeah, apparently not. Interesting. So So then Beatrice Cenci would not be painted by Elisabetta Sirani then, but the interest in maltreated female
Yes, no,
could
definitely.
tie in some way.
sure, yeah.
And she is also changing the language of the books, as Maria Antonia had explained us. She has changed in her book the language of writing.
Yeah, I'm trying to use the language of the actual record. So using, in fact, in the trial of Beatrice, there are a lot of witnesses, maids and women that were, like the wife of the murderer, the actual murderer, and so we have a way to hear the voices of these women of this social level, which usually is pretty much quiet because, unless they own something or they were, of the upper classes, they really don't appear in the records. So, okay, sure. Yeah.